All right, everyone, it's time for Vermont Issues episode 91. We were first on civil unions. We've actually now erected a state marker to celebrate that fact. Like, we were the first to push the issue in a legislative fashion, and then, of course, we were the first state as well to get gay marriage without the courts being involved. Here we did it in a legislative manner. Massachusetts and I believe Maryland, if I remember correctly, were both before us on actual marriage. But Vermont has seemingly slowed down on trying to be the state that pushes the envelope. And I think that's regrettable because we're a smaller state with a smaller population, we're kind of quirky. We have quirky politicians, we have sort of a quirky, weird culture. We can, because we have that control of an actual state apparatus, it's so much easier for us to push issues ahead more easily than a larger, more bureaucratic state can. Like, in a lot of states, on any issue, you'd have a problem between your urban area and your suburban area. The differential there means it's more difficult to maneuver to have an overwhelming majority of people supporting something. Vermont is more homogenous. The vast majority of the state's population lives in a few small town regions and then Burlington. That's basically it. And then you have, maybe a couple 100,000 people in more rural areas, but they're not that far usually from those towns anyway. And so we're all sort of in the same boat. There are different situations county to county, like Rutland is not Burlington and Burlington is not White River Junction. They've got different problems and different pros and cons of being in those areas. But it's more similar because it's smaller. Rhode Island would probably have about the same advantage, except that they're so urban, it gets more legalism in there. But I think that we should be the ones taking the reins on the drug war. I think that if we can get the ridiculous Phil Scott out of there, and we can get somebody in there who's actually an activist on this issue, the legislature can go further than just, hey, let's legalize recreational pot and we'll tax and stuff. No, we should be moving to decriminalize all substances at the same time. We should refuse to enforce the actual federal laws. And the federal government's not going to do jack shit about it. They already backed down on marijuana. They no longer bother to try in states where it's been legalized. Simply decriminalize. You see, the states can boil the frog in the direction of liberty. This is something that hasn't been done very often, but the states certainly can do this. That's all we have to do. We just have to get the ball rolling. All we have to do is lay the groundwork and say, okay, well, we're reducing sentencing, and then, a few years later you say, okay, we're outright decriminalizing these other substances. We're no longer sending someone to Kentucky to pay $55,000 or whatever an ordinance summit is a year to keep them in jail. It's not necessary. And then you go from there, and pretty soon the federal government sits back and realizes, oh shit, they legalized heroin so that they can get people into treatment rather than spending huge sums on an industrial prison complex. Now it's starting to metastasize to other states. Shit, it's an anti-drug war revolution. That's all you have to do. It would probably help to have somebody who's a governor who's actually used psychotropics, and I don't mean, smoked weed 20 years ago. No, I mean, like, used other substances, knows about them, knows what they do, how they feel, to some degree. Thankfully, the next crop of politicians we're going to see, a lot of them will fit into that category. Of course, some of the hippie-era politicians probably already did and just didn't want to talk about it too much. Yeah, don't tell anybody about that bag of mushrooms I've got under my bed, says, John McCain 20, 30 years ago. That's one issue we should take the reins on. Another, I would say, should be gun rights. We can balance the two, by the way. All you need as well is somebody in an executive position to cobble together enough votes by making grand bargains. The idea is that you give some sacred cow, pro-liberty sacred cow always, this should be the goal, to the further left while doing the same for the further right. There are a handful of people in Vermont, mostly from the Northeast Kingdom and areas like that are more red, that are actually extremely conservative. They would love nothing better than to really poke Washington, D.C. by taking a far blue state and making it even more pro-gun than it already is, resulting in a legendary status. Repeal all extant gun control and start refusing to deal with the federal government on that too. Just keep the state agencies from willfully cooperating. Force them to get 10 piles of paperwork signed to do butt-fuck anything. That would be wonderful. And at the same time, you give the left, scaling back the drug war, decriminalizing things, setting the stage for a further push later. I would say we've already led the way on so many issues throughout time. It's not just, by the way, we had civil unions first. Yeah, we were ahead of like the Obama when he was campaigning to be a senator. It was years later. He was still against gay marriage, and he was barely on board with civil unions. Hillary Clinton, when she was campaigning, again, years later, oh, no, I believe in traditional marriage. Meanwhile, Vermont was like, fuck you. There's no reason to discriminate in a legal fashion. We're just not gonna call it marriage. We're gonna go a little bit more tepid, because at the time, even the progressives here largely didn't want to raise the specter of calling it marriage. They didn't want to get slammed because no other state had done it. Civil unions were more of a mild form of that. We are leaders in gun rights. We were leaders in the anti-slavery movement. In fact, we abolished it before we became a state. Our state constitution adapted off the resolutions passed when we were still an independent republic for a year there, when we got our own independence from Britain after the revolution. Right before we joined, we had already drawn it up and said, no, we're not going to have slavery here in Vermont. And that would have become a huge issue. Like if you hadn't had the abolition of the concept in the northern states, Vermont probably would have stayed independent. We'd probably be a micro-state right now. Who would bother to invade us for our mountains? I don't think it would happen. Not exactly the most economically prosperous region, not the most economically important. I don't think the U.S. or the British or anyone else would have left us alone. We would have been a small landlocked province. It would have been pretty funny. It would be like Wallachia or something, only minus their sea coast that I think they had. But we can lead the way on issues so much more easily. Meanwhile, we've got other states now taking the reins on some of them. Like on the drug war, we're still holding out against legalization. A whole bunch of, I think, a half a dozen other states, isn't it? Washington State, Colorado, well, didn't Maryland, I believe, also legalize? And Maine, I think, did also. Alaska, and California, I believe, has legalized marijuana now as well. It's a substantial number of states. We're not one of them. We're still a decriminalized state. Well, New Hampshire just joined us. New Hampshire is sort of like our slightly more liberty-loving but more wonky, slightly smaller but more populated brother. We're the twin states. We should probably be one state, but, for various reasons, we're not. Are we going to let the people of New Hampshire take the lead on these issues and sit back on our laurels and say, yeah, 100 years ago we were socially there and we were sort of the happening state that drove these, and we really pissed people off. You remember Vermont's reputation early on in the gay marriage stuff was, these horrific, anti-Christian sodomites living up in these cold mountains just want to, have gay sex, I guess, all winter. That was sort of the running joke about our state among such wonderful people as like Bill O'Reilly, Pat Robertson, that other dude that sells the survival buckets and constantly gets joked about now, Jim Baker or Bacher, however you pronounce it. Everyone wanted to joke about how evil we were at the time. Now, of course, people look back a little differently. I think we need to take the charge in both directions. It needs to be pro-gun, anti-surveillance, very much pro-First Amendment. We should protect tech firms within our state from any sort of foreign repercussion. We should demand that they abide by our state constitution, which has the same guarantors. By the way, that's the other thing that I hadn't thought of before. The states really could take the reins on the tech issue. We could strip California of a fairly large amount of its pro-censorship power by simply empowering our own states and saying, okay, if you want to do business in our state, we'll give you even better tax breaks and everything. So you should come here. But you're going to have to abide by our specific state constitutions, not just the federal one. You're going to have to abide by, hey, respecting users' speech, respecting users' privacy. You get a query from some federal agency, some foreign group. Oh, we want user info. No. You can't do that. You have to consult with the state, with the state's own attorneys. We could do that too. Oh, we could do all sorts of stuff. We'd have a new states' rights movement. It wouldn't even be like a Confederate-style movement. Wouldn't have anything to do with the slavery issue. And Vermont could be on the forefront, but we don't have a leader right now who has the balls to take the reins and actually attempt to use the state's legal apparatus to drive issues in various directions. If we had that, or if any state that was more rural, it was easier to get things done, like a New Hampshire. New Hampshire would probably be the runner-up there. An Alaska, and Wyoming maybe, or even like a Rhode Island, just something that's physically very small. It would be much easier for those states to do so than a state perhaps with more diversity, geographically and demographically speaking, of course. That's about all. Peace out.